We did it again. I like that shirt. Really?
Really?
That's awesome. So pink means...
That's just the test.
I know. It just says the pink is going to be girls.
I don't know. Just the test.
That's awesome.
There are moments in true crime where the loudest evidence is not what is found, but what is missing. A word never spoken. A reaction that never comes. A question left unanswered, even when asked directly. In this story, silence arrived before violence. And long before anyone understood what had happened, there was already something wrong with what wasn't being said. This channel exists to examine those spaces. The gaps between appearances and truth. Between public certainty and private collapse. If you value careful storytelling, remembrance over spectacle, and stories that ask more than they answer, you're in the right place. Stay with us. Because this case was never about rage. It was about removal. In the weeks before Shanann Watts disappeared, there was no single moment that announced the end. No slammed doors. No public unraveling. What existed instead was routine, carefully maintained, publicly visible, and relentlessly optimistic. Photos appeared online like clockwork. Morning smiles, family outings, children dressed in coordinated colors, captions full of gratitude and resolve, a life narrated as if speaking stability into existence could make it permanent. And for many people watching from the outside, it worked. Shannon's life looked busy, full, determined. A woman who believed in effort, in improvement, in fixing what felt unsteady by leaning into it harder. But perfection, when repeated often enough, stops being celebration. It becomes camouflage. Behind the images, there were quieter signals, missed responses, financial strain softened by motivational language, a marriage increasingly described rather than lived. And then there was Chris Watts, present in photos, absent in tone. He appeared steady, agreeable, unremarkable, a man who did not argue, did not explode, did not announce dissatisfaction. He was described again and again as easygoing. But ease can also be emptiness. People close to the couple would later describe something subtle but persistent. Chris seemed to be receding, not angry, not volatile, just gone. Shorter answers, less eye contact, delayed responses that felt less like distraction and more like disinterest. Withdrawal doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like compliance. Shanann noticed. That matters. She noticed the emotional distance and tried to close it. She documented her concern in messages to friends. She asked questions directly. She sought reassurance not through accusation, but through effort. Trips were planned, conversations initiated, counseling discussed. She reached outward toward solutions, toward communication, toward hope. This imbalance is crucial. One partner leaning forward, the other standing still. Not resisting, not refusing, just not moving. Psychologically, this kind of dynamic is dangerous not because it is loud, but because it is stabilizing, until it is. Chris did not argue his way out of the marriage in his mind. He stepped out of it quietly. There is a temptation, in cases like this, to search for the moment everything snapped. But nothing snapped here. What happened instead was erosion. The language Chris used began to thin. He spoke less about the future. When asked about plans, he responded with non-answers, vague affirmations, neutral statements that revealed nothing and committed him to nothing. Silence became a tool. And silence, when used consistently, creates control without confrontation. This is where fantasy enters. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that offers relief. An alternate emotional life emerged, lighter, simpler, stripped of responsibility. In this world, there were no bills to manage, no children to carry upstairs, no expectations to meet. Fantasy doesn't begin as betrayal. It begins as permission. Permission to imagine a self without weight. And once that imagined version feels real enough, reality becomes an obstacle. By the summer of 2018, the distance was no longer theoretical. Shanann was pregnant. The family structure was expanding, not shrinking. For someone seeking escape, this was not grounding. It was suffocating. And yet Chris did not leave. That detail matters. Leaving would have required explanation, conflict, ownership. Instead, he remained physically present while emotionally elsewhere. This is not passivity. It is avoidance elevated to strategy. When Shanann traveled out of state shortly before her disappearance, she was not running from her marriage. She was reaching for it. Messages sent during that time reveal a woman still trying to understand what had changed, still trying to anchor something that felt like it was drifting away. Chris's responses were polite, controlled, emotionally flat. Not cruel, just empty. People often misunderstand this type of behavior because it doesn't match the stereotype of danger. There was no history of violence, no public outbursts, no documented threats. But danger does not always announce itself through aggression. Sometimes it arrives as detachment. When Shanann and her children vanished, the first thing many noticed was how calm Chris appeared. Too calm, some would say later. But calm alone is not evidence. It is context. He spoke to police without visible panic. He cooperated. He offered timelines that sounded reasonable on the surface. Yet language tells its own story. He spoke about his family in past-oriented terms, even before there was confirmation of harm. He emphasized logistics over emotion. He used phrases that created distance, they instead of names, routines instead of relationships. This is not proof. It is pattern. And patterns accumulate. As the investigation progressed, the weight of fact began to replace the ambiguity of psychology. Security footage, phone records, worksite data. Each piece quietly contradicted the version of reality Chris presented. Still, what remained striking was not panic, but control. Even as evidence closed in, there was no emotional collapse, no visible reckoning. Confession, when it came, was fragmented, incomplete, shifting. Each version minimized responsibility while maintaining the illusion of cooperation. This is not chaos. It is calculation under pressure. And then there was the autopsy. Clinical, impersonal, necessary. The autopsy does not tell stories. It records facts. But sometimes facts speak. Shannon's body revealed evidence not of sudden rage, but of restraint. The absence of defensive injuries suggested compliance or incapacitation. There was no indication of a prolonged struggle. This matters because it aligns with everything that came before. Control without confrontation. Removal without explosion. The body told the same story the behavior had been telling for months. This was not a loss of control. It was its final expression. In court, the language shifted again. The narrative was anchored to evidence, not interpretation. Prosecutors laid out a sequence that made clear this was not an accident, not a momentary lapse. It was decided. And while psychological explanations were discussed, they were never offered as excuses. Understanding is not absolution. The consequences were permanent, as they should be. What remains after verdicts and sentences is the harder work. Remembering who Shanann was beyond the ending. A woman who tried, who believed effort mattered, who reached for connection even when it wasn't returned. Her children are remembered not through the violence done to them, but through the routines that defined them: bedtimes, laughter, the ordinary innocence that should have been protected. The legacy of this case is not the man who committed the crime. It is the warning it leaves behind. That silence can be lethal. That avoidance can metastasize. That entitlement does not always shout, it often whispers. Some crimes are not explosions. They are exits. If this story made you pause, sit with that feeling. If it raised questions about emotional withdrawal, control, or the warning signs we're taught to overlook, share your thoughts below. This channel exists for conversation, not speculation but understanding. Remember the victims. Question the silence. And stay curious enough to look beneath what seems normal. We'll continue this story. What makes this case endure is not the brutality of the act, but the banality of the lead-up. Nothing about the days before suggested rupture. No final argument witnessed. No public collapse. No dramatic farewell. Instead, there was routine. Chris Watts went to work. He texted when prompted. He responded when spoken to. He performed normalcy the way one performs a task, efficiently, without emotional investment. This is where many people struggle to understand cases like this. We expect warning signs to be loud. We look for anger, volatility, desperation. But the most dangerous transformations often happen in silence. Psychologists who later examined the behavioral arc of this case noted something consistent: emotional disengagement paired with internal entitlement. Not the entitlement of superiority, but of escape. The belief that one deserves a different life without paying the cost of leaving the current one honestly. That belief does not require hatred. It only requires detachment. The financial records told a story that words did not. Mounting debt, legal pressure, a household sustained by optimism and denial rather than stability. Shanann was not ignorant of these realities. She confronted them head-on, searching for solutions, restructuring plans, attempting to regain footing. Chris did not. Not because he was unaware, but because confrontation would have required presence. Avoidance became the defining strategy. When faced with pressure, he did not argue. He withdrew. When asked to engage, he minimized. When expectations rose, he imagined an alternate future where expectations no longer existed. Fantasy, again, becomes critical here. It wasn't only about another relationship. It was about erasure. In that imagined world, he was unburdened, untethered, free of obligation without being the one who destroyed it. But fantasies demand resolution, and reality does not dissolve on its own. The children, Bella and Celeste, were not described by investigators in terms of trauma, but in terms of routine. Who tucked them in? Who carried them upstairs? Who lingered at their doors? And what changed? Caregivers noticed distance, missed gestures, a father who was physically present but emotionally unreachable. Children register absence before they understand loss. That absence is not dramatic. It is quiet, and it leaves marks that never appear in reports. As law enforcement reconstructed the timeline, what stood out was not speed but order. Nothing about the morning suggested panic. Movements were deliberate. Tasks completed in sequence. This is where the myth of crime of passion collapses entirely. Passion is messy. This was methodical. Even disposal followed logic, not frenzy. The acts themselves were horrific, but what disturbed investigators most was how little emotion accompanied them. No escalation. No deviation. Just execution. Control maintained until the very end. When Chris Watts spoke after his arrest, his language remained evasive even when his freedom was gone. Confessions shifted. Details emerged selectively. Responsibility was acknowledged only when unavoidable. This is not confusion. It is preservation of self-image. Even stripped of everything, he attempted to manage perception, to soften intent, to reframe decisions as reactions. But the evidence refused to cooperate. Digital footprints contradicted narratives. Autopsy findings dismantled claims of spontaneity. Behavioral analysis exposed patterns that could no longer be denied. The story did not change because he told the truth. It changed because the truth cornered him. The courtroom phase of this case did not linger on theatrics. There were no long trials, no dramatic cross-examinations. Because the facts were overwhelming, prosecutors emphasized one central point. This was not accidental, emotional, or reactive. It was planned in the sense that matters most internally. The decision preceded the act. That distinction matters legally, but it matters more morally. Because it means this was not about losing control. It was about reclaiming it. In victim impact statements, the tone shifted again. Here, language carried grief without spectacle, love without explanation. Shanann was remembered not as an influencer, not as a social media presence, but as a daughter, a friend, a mother who fought for her family even when it was already slipping away. Her children were remembered through moments, small hands, favorite routines, ordinary joys that should have grown into futures. This is where true crime must slow down. Because the danger of analysis is that it can eclipse humanity. And this story is not about understanding a perpetrator more than it understands a loss. There is a cultural impulse to ask, why didn't she see it coming? That question misunderstands how control operates. Control does not announce itself as threat. It often presents as calm. Shanann trusted stability because stability was what she worked to create. She believed communication could bridge distance because that belief had likely worked before. Hindsight transforms subtle signs into obvious warnings, but only after the cost is irreversible. That is not failure. That is human. What this case ultimately exposes is not a monster hiding in plain sight, but a system of avoidance allowed to deepen unchecked. A man who never learned to confront discomfort. A culture that mistakes emotional quiet for safety. A narrative that equates violence with rage, ignoring the damage done by withdrawal. Silence in this context was not neutral. It was active. Every unanswered message, every non-response, every moment of disengagement. Each one was a step away. And exits, when pursued without accountability, leave devastation behind. This is why the autopsy matters. Not because of what it revealed physically, but because it confirmed what behavior had already shown psychologically. There was no evidence of chaos, only finality. That truth is uncomfortable because it suggests prevention is not always about spotting danger, but about recognizing disappearance. When someone begins to vanish emotionally, when responsibility becomes a burden instead of a bond, when fantasy replaces effort, those are not harmless phases. They are fractures. The sentence handed down ensured that Chris Watts would never walk free again. But justice, in cases like this, is not only about punishment. It is about record, about numbing what happened accurately. Not a tragedy, not a mistake, not a moment, a decision. As time passes, new audiences discover this case through headlines, documentaries, and shortened clips. Algorithms compress it, narratives simplify it. But compression is the enemy of truth. Because this story does not fit into outrage alone. It requires patience. It requires listening to silence. If you are watching this and thinking about someone who has grown distant, or about a relationship where communication has thinned into routine, or about warning signs that don't look like danger yet, pause. This story is not meant to frighten. It is meant to sharpen awareness. Control does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal. Shanann Watts and her children deserve to be remembered not as symbols of a crime, but as lives interrupted by entitlement and avoidance. Their legacy is not fear. It is clarity. If this documentary moved you, if it made you reconsider how we define warning signs, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Conversations like this matter when they center truth and remembrance, not spectacle. Subscribe if you value slow, careful storytelling that honors victims and refuses easy answers. And above all, remember them not for how they were taken, but for how fully they lived before silence replaced honesty. Because some crimes are not explosions. They are exits, and the cost is always paid by those left behind.